These are basically the protests that were taking place yesterday in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Yesterday, as I brought to you, this took place. Something that I have never seen in America. A police station on fire. A police station on fire. Now, as the police station basically burned, there's this kind of weird cathartic feeling associated with that, right? I mean, basically, this thing that has been responsible for something that is utterly atrocious, ironically and literally, is in flames. I don't know, it was just a jarring sight, and I have to be honest, whether it's productive, whether it's not productive, whether, good, bad, depending upon the way you frame it, secondary. For me, it was satisfying. Now, the officer, Chauvin, has been arrested and he is being indicted for third-degree murder. At the very least, that's where it's starting off, basically manslaughter. Other 3 officers were fired, even though no charges have been brought against them yet. The attorney that's dealing with this case, Hennepin County, Freeman. Yes, Freeman. He is basically making the point of saying, look, I issued these charges much faster than we would typically do it. The evidence was backed up, so I went along with making these charges. Now, you understand why he's making these charges. The police station is on fire. I mean, whatever slow it down that you might do from the standpoint of a prosecutor at the moment that the public screams out, and not just the African American community. It was so egregious, the death and the killing of George Flynn, that white, black, gay, straight, Asian human beings came out in mass in order to protest what happened. That's how obscene it was. It was something that was understood as easily as breathing at how horrible what just took place and the depravity associated with putting your knee on a man's throat until the man stops breathing. He had a philosophical responsibility to check on him. You realize that. The man said I couldn't breathe and he didn't care. So despite the prosecutions, despite the, let's say, preliminary stages of trying to, form a case, the protests have gone on unabated. This is in Atlanta, Georgia, CNN headquarters basically being destroyed. This is also taking place in my neck of the woods, Washington, D.C. And of course, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where all of this basically started. Those are currently going on right now as we speak. 4th night of protests. And this is despite hands up! There being a curfew in place. People are upset. People are angry. And I think the thing that you need to notice in this crowd is multiracial. Look, if nothing else, the notion of that, the ability for people to be able to come together in this way and to be able to push back against a system that they consider to be so egregious that all notions of typical way of operating go out the window, where a certain degree of justice cries out by a civilian population that recognizes that the typical instrument that is supposed to mete out justice is usually incapable of dealing with justice when it needs to be meted out against cops. And again, justice. Beyond the elections that are going on, Joe Biden gives a speech. Now, people are dead. It's not just one person, multiples. The same way about 10 years ago, the case like where Eric Garner was very similar to this one. Meaning, if there's any notion of accountability, if there's any notion of justice, is there any notion of fairness in our society where we look at one person and say that person has the same value and worth just intrinsic to who that person is like anybody else? And as such, we will prosecute crimes if that person is killed. And for that matter, we would protect and serve if that person requires it. But we know in real terms that's not what happens. Certain races get certain or more deference in regards to the way, or more latitude in the way they can engage and interact with cops, are less likely to get shot, less likely to get put in prison, less likely to get longer prison sentences. Those things are factors of racism in respects, especially from the standpoint of where they police and issues of class, whereas they would choose certain policing opportunities that are easier to convict as opposed to the ones that are more difficult in some of the richer or wealthier neighborhoods. It's intrinsically linked. Joe Biden comes out and gives a speech that seems that he's barely conscious in giving the speech. And apparently his objective in the speech was to emote. He wanted to emote empathy. He missed his mark.
Promise of this nation, real for all people. You know, this is no time for incendiary tweets. It's no time to encourage violence. This is a national crisis. We need real leadership right now. Leadership that will bring everyone to the table so we can take measures to root out systemic racism. It's time for us to take a hard look at the uncomfortable truths. It's time for us to face that deep, open wound we have in this nation. We need justice for George Floyd. We need real police reform that hold cops to a higher standard that so many of them actually meet.
And so many of them don't. And again, let's be very clear. Whatever Joe Biden is saying here, Joe Biden is a flagrant habitual liar. And Joe Biden, who told black people that you're not black if you don't vote for me, is now basically trying to emote. Whether he's trying to emote or not, Joe Biden is directly responsible from the standpoint of the economic hardship that he's put on people in our society, and also on the criminal justice angle of not dealing with the real material concerns of the population, instead just dumping a ton of money into cops and criminal justice. Joe Biden emoting, but not necessarily saying anything of worth or value, has a 40-year track record that basically makes all of this moot. Fact of the matter is, all of those African Americans that got killed, that got injured, that got shot, where people would shoot through the window, that would barge in through the doors and basically shoot anybody who's there, with the expanded number of beds in the various states, where Joe Biden put through that crime bill that made sure that states was able to receive money if you kept people in prison longer. And this doesn't even touch the crack cocaine disparity. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is many of the situations that we are talking about are both race and class, because those things are intrinsically linked to one another. In the quote-unquote original sin, as Joe Biden was talking about, you had people who were basically misformed and mistreated into slaves, basically little workers that can, for free, produce some particular product where they wouldn't have to pay for it. The point of it had to do with economics. By the same token, there's an element of race that came in it when you have a black skin, and then you can identify that black person much more clearer and easier, as opposed to having whites that are slaves or maybe potentially Native Americans that are slaves. But on top of that, having the disparity in skin color, especially when you enshrine in your society this disparity between who a person is of one color versus who somebody is of another color, and then perpetuate that and propagate that, where the society itself enshrines that into just an understanding and a cultural way of operating, that we are just better. Of course, people are going to want to think that they're better. And when people have certain advantages in the way that society dispenses those advantages based on the quirk of color or the quirk of class, well, those advantages are used, those advantages are protected. Meaning, when there is a differential in society, let's say random person is number 10, but an African American, let's say, is 5. And then you move up to the 80s and that number gets to 7. Well, no, the person who's 10 hasn't gone anywhere, but the relative distance between the 5 and 10 versus the 7 and 10 does make it seem as if there's a change that has taken place. Well, it has. You haven't lost any rights, or at the very least haven't lost any rights that don't necessarily infringe upon somebody else's ability to be free or to function in society without being chased down and murdered by a bunch of good old boys in a truck and not have your body taken a picture of and put on Snapchat, or for that matter, not be murdered in broad daylight with a bunch of civilians watching, taking their cameras, distraught, understanding what just took place. You just murdered a man in broad daylight. I don't care what you're emoting. I don't even give a shit what Obama had to say, because again, it was nothing, basically saccharine, that doesn't get to the heart of anything. If you're not going to deal with the edges of the economic and the capitalist system, then you are not really going to deal with any notion of racial disparities. They're linked. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party wants to deal with just issues of identity and take off these issues of economics as if these things aren't tethered. Do you think that if Eric Garner had, I don't know, $1,000 in the bank or was making $20 an hour, that he would be selling loose cigarettes? No. What about some of the other crimes where people are selling either pot or something on the street, or people are hustling this or that? If that incentive wasn't there of a standpoint of vulnerability, and your society dealt with those incentives of vulnerability that push people into one behavior or the other, or ensure that people have access to their needs, or don't have people in situations where they are perpetually vulnerable, that's a different world. And that's a different world where you are organically evolving out of those things. What does your world look like when anybody can go to school? Not saying you're forced to, but anybody can go to school without $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 of debt on their backs. What does it look like when you have job opportunities in your society, maybe a federal jobs guarantee, where you can get a credible, decent job where you have agency and that it get a decent paid wage for something that you actually feel like you're a part of? What does that look like? And does a situation where you have health care, where you have Social Security when you get older, meaning at the very least your basic requirements are met? And yes, you still work and those type of things, but at the end of the day, the main bills, the main major expenses that typically avail you that are not there in many of the countries in Europe, well, if those aren't there, that's a better world, that's a better life, that's less constriction. That's a person growing up not having to worry about where they're going to get their next meal from, not having to worry about whether or not they can keep the lights on while they're doing homework. I'm making the point that a lack of nutrition, a lack of areas, meaning let's say for like lead in the water or something in poor areas as opposed to some of the richer areas, we instantiate these economic inequalities into actual real material concerns in the way that people don't have those things to make sure that they can grow as human beings. If Joe Biden is going to take policy that basically moves to the right and to ignore issues of race only up until the point where he needs to either lie about being part of the civil rights movement or tokenize African Americans, going to black churches, lying to them one face after the next, then there's nothing here for him that he's putting out. I mean, the real honest work in this is, how do you stop this type of thing from happening in society? And what do you need to do in an underlying way, meaning in the fundamentals and the way that your society propagates itself? What do you need to do to ensure that these bad outcomes don't take place from the standpoint of race, and yes, also from the standpoint, that much more so, of class? I can't stop somebody from being racist. I don't know how to prevent that person for not giving me the amount of medication I need. I don't know how to stop that cop from looking at me as if I'm a threat just by me being there and just by me driving the car. How can you even be safe in your own home, considering that we've had multiple killings where African Americans were literally, supposedly, in the safety of their own home? In one case, a female cop, barges in and murders the guy. In another case, they barge in with a no warrant when the man defends his home from these goons that are raiding his house. They put 20 bullets in the house and murder Breonna Taylor, the woman who's basically in her underwear. I don't need you to emote. I don't need you to emote. I'm talking about what are the underlying factors of your society that creates difficulty, that creates vulnerability, that creates situations where people run in odd ways or roughshod friction in regards to the law. What are those ways for us to be able to deal with human health and happiness? What are those ways where we can cut down on the number of prisons, where we don't incentivize prisons, we incentivize schooling and education? How do we do that? And I'm making the point that those are things where you fund various sectors and resources and services of your society to make people less vulnerable. And in doing so, you allow human health, and greater degree of human development. If you're going to be Joe Biden, though, and you're a neoliberal, and you know you're not going to do that, you're not going to provide Medicare for all, even now, despite 88% supporting it. You're not going to get rid of universal student care where people aren't hit with 40, 50,000 debts on their backs. You're not going to put a situation in where there's an expansion of Social Security, where when people get a certain age, where they, for the most part, will be secure, that they've dedicated all of their energies, all of their muscles into making this world a better place. And then at the end, when we can't use them anymore because they're too old, we get rid of them. That shouldn't happen. There should be an increase in regards to taxes, especially whether it's a capital gains or whatever else. However you ever need to do it, do it. It's what the public wants. Do your job. There is a such thing what the public wants with Green New Deal. I'm making the point that these are things that the public is very clear on, and all of these policies would lead to the notion of human health and human development over the course of time as you get rid of some of the vagaries and the vulnerabilities in your system. I mean, for fuck's sake, Obama and Biden gave 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Now think about what that means. If 95% of the income gains is going to the top 1%, that is money that's not there for services, that is money that's not there for things that would benefit the majority of the population. But that's also money that's not going into wages. That's money being expropriated to the top. So 95% of the income gains go to the top 1%, leaving 5% for 99% of the population. And you're wondering why there's difficulties, why there's friction. And I'm not talking about this entirely from the standpoint of race. I'm talking about this from the standpoint also, and I gotta be honest, even to some degree more so, of class. Because that's the thing that cut across all of these lines. Where it's true, race and class are intrinsically linked. Let's just be very clear, there's also a lot of poor whites in this country also. Both things are true. But let's not fall into this democratic nonsense of only talking about race and leaving out the integral fact of class. Van Jones makes this mistake. And even though what Van Jones is saying here is right, he misses something. So let's hear Jones.
The racist white person who's in the Ku Klux Klan that we have to worry about. It's the white liberal Hillary Clinton supporter walking her dog in Central Park who would tell you right now, people like that, oh, I don't see race. Race is no big deal to me. I see us all as the same. I give to charities. But the minute she sees a black man who she does not respect or who she has a slight thought against, she weaponized race like she had been trained by the Aryan Nation. A Klans member could not have been better trained to pick up the police and pick up her phone and tell the police it's a black man, African-American man, come get him. So,
does a vampire have fangs? Does a vampire have fangs? Yes. Does a vampire use their fangs? Yes, it would be weird if a vampire didn't use their fangs, right? You have a situation in your society where there's a bias in regards to the dispensation of force when the police are called. Because that understood bias is there from the standpoint of society itself, understood as easily as breathing. Meaning when that case took place in the park that he's talking about, he's referring to, everybody understood what happened. I think that's more interesting. It wasn't a situation where she did that and people are like, hey, why did she call the cops like that? Why did she threaten the guy with the cop? No, everybody understood that there is a bias in regards to the way the cops engage with the African American community. And yes, also the poor. Sometimes often those things dovetail. I'm just making the very basic point that everybody understood what was taking place in that moment, that it was so enshrined and understood in a cultural understanding that the cops are going to work for her and people who look like her, and the people who don't look like her will be at somewhat of a disadvantage. This is a card that is in the pocket of pretty much any white person, give or take. Now, I'm not saying anybody or everybody will use it. There's a hurdle of just disgusting, misanthropic cowardice that has to be overcome in order to do something like that, especially when you know that it's a threat on the person's life potentially in doing so. By the same token, the person can overcome that hurdle of disgusting person if they believe that whatever is taking place matters more than them being a disgusting, horrible, cowardly person, which is where Van Jones is coming in at. Meaning, regardless, people saying, I don't do this or I don't do that, you're basically one anger or rage moment away from doing some shit like this. I have family members who engage with or was working, messing with white women, and they have told them that. Like, I'm trying to make this point that the woman who did that, that's not uncommon. My wife, same thing. She has one of her brothers. Hey, I can call the cops and that'll be your ass. This is there. And this is one of those things that people, it's understood. One catch. It's not that what Van Jones is saying here is necessarily wrong. When Van Jones made this point, some Hillary supporters got mad at Van Jones and called him a thug, missing the point of saying, I'm not racist, that thug, I can't stand him. You sound a little racist if you're calling Van Jones a thug. I guess the very basic point that I'm making here, though, is what you can't ignore is the class element of this. What does the world look like when people aren't, struggling on the streets trying to make ends meet? What does it look like when they are not entirely or engaging with this kind of legal aspect of your society, because those people, for the most part, are whole? What does it look like when those people can grow and prosper? And there's not this, not having money to keep the lights on, not having money to get the medication you need, not drinking water out of lead pipes, not being in a situation where you don't necessarily have the resources and the nutrients that you need to get from point A to point B. You realize that those things present over generations weaknesses within the context of either people dealing with famine, not having the resources or the things that they need. Those things present in people going forward in various generations, not just the generation that affects. I'm trying to make the point that your world, your society creates the very thing that these people are basically complaining and fighting about. And the question becomes, how do you, A, bring down the tension that's in your society among various groups and various tribes? And that is entirely economic. From the other aspect of how do you deal with racist behavior either in cops or either in medicine or basically some kind of inequality, well, that's a different conversation, and that's a more difficult conversation, and that takes somewhat of a concerted effort of a population. But what Van Jones is saying here, you can't ignore the issue of class. When Martin Luther King was making his arguments, they try to exclude race and economics from King's speech. But King, when he got killed, if I'm not mistaken, was marching in regards to workers' rights or increasing the wage. I'm making the point that how we engage with one another, especially when we are whole as human beings, we have the things that we need. We're not being broken in these kind of diseases of despair. That's a different world. That's a different engagement with these other aspects of your society. And yeah, it makes it to a situation where it is less likely to end up with these harsh outcomes. By the same token, these people are still loaded guns. And cops roaming around your society like that, if you're not going to take a concerted will to do something about it, then there is no justice in this process. And of course, every time something like this happens, there's not going to be peace either. Van Jones, I think here is right. I just think Van Jones misses the class aspect of this analysis. I'll leave this here. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks all.